You would like your vendor, when you are outsourcing your work, you would like your vendor to be totally professional, etc., and objective, and the like. Now, the question is, when it comes to assessing someone's work, what is the basis of your assessment, right? Is it based on some kind of template, some kind of rules, or is it just subjective impressionism, like, oh, I liked it, or I didn't like it? Like the famous, PR agencies who tell you, I don't like this concept art, and you ask, okay, so what don't you really like about it? Yeah, I don't like it, please present something else, right? So that kind of feedback is actually not really fruitful. So if you want to assess someone, try to be as objective as possible. Do not do it when you're having a bad day, basically, right? Because you may just unleash all hell on your partner. That's not a very good idea. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, when companies cooperate, or a company with a freelancer cooperates, there are usually two different fundamental approaches to cooperation. So one is called relational, and the other is called transactional. Do you know the difference? Okay, so transactional basically means that no matter what happens, I want to get the best financial deal possible, which in other words means I want it cheap, right? Which is okay, it is a tempting strategy, right? Because you don't want to splash out millions, but it works in a short term. In mid-term and long term, it actually doesn't work. So it's better to have relational, because you can still expect reasonable pricing, but your vendor, your freelancer, or you as freelancers, will be more willing to go down the extra mile when the deadline is tight, when anything happens in the project, in the process, you'll be more likely to be willing to help your client and says, okay, so it's transactional. If it's transactional, you will understand quickly that no matter what you do, they will go and get someone else the next time around if they're cheaper, right? So you're just not going to do that. So yeah, so are we partners, or we are the master and the servant in that relation, right? So that's another thing. The third thing is about swift communication. So when companies want to outsource stuff to some people, they say, okay, you need to be quick. It's always quick, right? Fine. But the point is the person who is on the client side cooperating with that company, are they quick enough? Because, for instance, we've had numerous situations where we were expected to provide quick answers, solutions, etc., but we did not get any answers from the person who was assigned to the job on the client's part. So, for instance, there was one game that we localized, an RPG, that when we actually closed the deal, we had 500 questions asked, out of which like 350 came unanswered. So like 350 cases of we may be right, we may be wrong, who knows, right? So yeah, so that goes both ways again. And about those timelines, this is one fundamental thing that people tend to forget about. When you cooperate as a client again, and you want to outsource your work for your game, you usually have got one deadline. That's the launch date for your game, right? So you focus on that particular deadline. While if you are cooperating with an outsourced company who does that professionally, they've got hundreds of different deadlines because there are hundreds of different clients, right? So if you think about it, who should care more about the deadline actually being met? Of course, both of you, right? But you should be the ones with your deadline and try to stick to it. And another thing about, this symmetrical approach, since you want to have professional cooperation, you would rather try to be calm and composed, right? So, for instance, if that's my speech, if I started shouting, probably you would think I'm crazy, right? So that wouldn't actually, have a good note with you. So that's the same kind of thing with cooperating, because remember, when you are a freelancer or an outsource, or you are the client who is outsourcing, usually your partner on the other line is usually just an address, an email address, or a person who is typing stuff, not a person per se, because you have never met them. Perhaps you will one day, but sometimes you just don't. So it's easy to unleash like your frustration on that person because it's just, it's just writing emails. Don't do that because it's not helping. So that's the first fundamental pillar. Now a case study, because all those 5 pillars will come with real life studies. So this is the project details we had. Let me quickly go over. All right, so that's a pretty big project, recent. It was released this year, and it's a AA publisher, so close to AAA, not AAA yet. Survival game, 90,000 words multiplied by 7 languages. That gives you more than 600,000 words to localize. Now, the point is about those deadlines. Again, the deadline, right? So we were supposed to have some certain timeline to cover that entire project, but it didn't work, right? Because, oh, we are late with our development, you see, you need to wait. You were supposed to have like 5 months or 6 months, you're gonna have like 2.5 months to cover the project. Can you do that, please? When you are the outsource company, you always say, yeah, of course, we'll manage to do that. But remember, 600,000 words for those 7 languages, and then the project manager on the client side writes something like that. Because that was a male, he picked on one phrase, utilize the dead, which was translated into Polish into a particular way, and he said, that translation of this word is an ultimate crime on the Polish language, and there is more. Oh, right, so you get, that's a really serious feedback, right? But the point is, objectively speaking, the translation was correct. There were no more instances like that for those 600,000 words. And he extrapolated this one single word, saying, okay, so if I found this in your Polish language, then probably there are lots of other stuff in Chinese, German, French, or Russian, right? Because I'm sure it's going to be like that. It wasn't. In the end, so the rhetorical questions, was he objective? No, really. Was he cool-headed? Not really. This is not the kind of thing you would like to see when you are like, the outsource company from your client, serious client, right? And by the way, of course, the top brass of that company, the managers were satisfied with their work, so we continue working. That guy got fired. Not just because of that, by the way, but yeah, he actually was laid off after this project. Right, so that was the first pillar, which is symmetry. Now, modesty. Now, hands up people who like to be criticized, even if the criticism is justified. Me. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, that's pretty reasonable, right? If the criticism is justified, then this is not the most happy thing you would like to hear, but okay, you're right, I'm going to correct myself, blah, blah, blah. Now, hands up people who like to have their basic expertise questioned. No one? Yeah, no one. Obviously, right? I mean, when you are like us, the outsource company, and you want to perform localization on audio or quality assurance services, whatever, we don't tend to question the other party's basic skills of programming, right? So I don't tell them, okay, you should program in that particular way or this particular way. We don't do that, right? I mean, it's not my area of expertise, it's yours. But on the other hand, if someone is trying to complete, for instance, their first localization project ever, and we've done thousands, and they tell us obvious things which are not, how to put that mildly, right, then we say, okay, but that's just not the way it is, right? So it's a very good assumption to think when you cooperate with the outsource. You do the outsource for a very reason, because it's not your area of expertise, right? So you need to trust that if you've selected a particular vendor, they should know what they're doing, right? So the fundamental question is, who should be the person, or what kind of a psychological profile that person should have to be able to run this cooperation smoothly on your part if you are the client? Here is a list that is, I think those are the basics, right? So empathy, I would stress that one as the first one. In order to cooperate smoothly in any area, you need to try and understand why certain people reason in a certain way. What's the background from it, right? I mean, what are they actually trying to tell you? And try to feel themselves or feel yourselves in their situation. Now, good listener and negotiator, obviously, because usually deadlines are tight for any kind of outsource. So you need to also understand that once the other party tells you, no, it's impossible, they tell you because it's really impossible, right? Not because they don't want to work with you. Now, communicative and swift reacting. This is partly from the first pillar, so to speak. But communicative also means, and it's quite frequently forgotten, a person that writes well in English, usually in English, unless you, of course, have got like a Chinese person to cooperate with a Chinese person, which is preferred, by the way, with Chinese. But but if it's like the lingua franca, which is still English all over the world, this person needs to be able to write properly, because there are certain nuances. Like I said before, you don't meet usually those people on the other side of the line in person very frequently. So it's all about what you write and say in your emails, in your communication channels, whatever, right? So you need to be sensitive about certain word choices. Sometimes I've seen people who are trying to say some really objective, neutral things, but they said that in such a dry tone that it might be perceived on the other front. It's like, he's just offhandish, right? I mean, he doesn't have time for me. Or he may be offensive, or he may be tired. Questions start to pop up in your brain when this communication is not right. And one more thing here. Now, if you want to select the person to run this outsourced cooperation with a vendor, with a company, with a freelancer, when it's a big company like, you know, the ones we work with, so Activision, Blizzard, or Electronic Arts, or Sony, usually there is a special cell that specializes in that kind of field, which is, of course, a preferred solution. When someone or a company is smaller, they don't have separate, you know, vendor management cells, right? So sometimes it's like, oh yeah, Mr. Programmer, so you're free today and the next week, so why don't you just cooperate with those guys, because you're the only one free right now, right? Or, oh, hey, programmer, or hey, 3D modeler, whatever. So, you know, picking accidental people because they're free today. It's not really working for many reasons, because they've never been a frontman in your organization, they have never been on the other side. This is the preferred profile or portfolio of a person, right? Ideally a person who has once been on the other side of the river, right? And seen that from the different perspective, because they will be empathetic. So that's the modesty, number 2 in our pillars. Now, a case study about modesty. So again, the very basic assumption, assume you don't know everything about everything. Now, here's the project details. So mid-sized publisher, simulation game, more than 160,000 words to localize into English and French with LQA. You know what LQA is, right? Linguistic quality assurance, right? Which means testing the game inside the game code. And drawing from our experiences with other publishers, we sort of assume that for that kind of volume, text volume, you should have at least 300 to 400 hours. That's the minimum to really be able to tell your clients, yes, it's done correctly, we've had enough time, we managed to do everything about, you know, this linguistic testing. But when we were quoting this, this service for this publisher, by that time we had come to realize that they are a little, how to put that, stingy, strapped for cash, not really a lot of cash to spend. So we figured, okay, so if we tell them 400 hours, they're going to go bananas, right? So no, 400 hours, no. So then we think, okay, so what is like the basic minimum of hours we should offer so that it's still feasible project, but they don't have to pay through the nose, as the English say, right? So we said 160-ish hours should be enough. And the project manager on the client side, he writes a very offended email. We estimate the gameplay time of a 4 players below 10 hours for a single playthrough. As such, I have to admit I don't quite see how we've arrived at 160 hours. It's like you're trying to rip me off. And then you can have a swear word that you want to, you know, put here. So now, why did that person write this kind of reply? Because they had no clue about linguistic testing. They thought that LQA is like being a casual gamer who goes through the game. You can finish that game in 10 hours, of course, why not? But there are so many subplots, descriptions, such an amount of text that you need to go through that a linguistic tester needs to do everything. Look under every single stone, uncover every single puzzle, read all the descriptions, whatever it is in the game, they need to do that. So 10 hours, not really. 20 hours, not really. So again, assume that you don't know everything about everything and they're going to be fine. There are going to be questions after that, okay? So just remember about your question and then you'll ask them. So number 3, what happened here? Oh yeah, anticipation. So that's kind of obvious. Plan, right? Plan ahead for everyone's sake. It's not just your vendor, for your own good too. right? So the point about our own here, this area of expertise, is that localization is usually procrastinated, delayed, put off, postponed, whatever other synonym you can insert here, right? And we are thinking quite a lot why actually this thing happens. And there are usually a few reasons behind that. It's usually because of lack of knowledge, right? So people have no prior experience in that field, so they don't know how to deal with it. So okay, that's the psychological thing, right? So I don't know how to approach it, so I'm going to just put it aside and then put it aside again. Procrastination, you know, in its purest form. And the other thing is, it's not just it's not just no prior experience, but it's also lack of understanding. Why would I even do it? I mean, do I really have to spend that kind of cash for, like, you know, different languages? I mean, why? Of course, if you really ask that question, then the answer is because it boosts your sales into different categories, into different territories, right? So French people will expect you to have the French localization. Like German people will expect that, the Russians, Poles, many countries. And they also don't know how to approach this phase. So there are a few golden rules. So again, in our area of expertise, it should be done pretty late in the process of game development, but it shouldn't be done too late, if you see what I mean. So the text, for instance, should be, or the audio should be more or less finalized, but you still need to assume that there needs to be some buffer zone after that, because there is always going to be changes. Even if you think at a certain point in time that your texts are finalized, usually they are not finalized, right? So you need to have this buffer time for the people to actually change anything in the process. And then there's also the right sequence. So this analogy with cooking. I'm no chef, but if you ask me to do scrambled eggs, you know, on bacon, right? So I probably wouldn't start from like trying to boil eggs on a cold pan, right? So probably I would start first with, you know, heating up the pan and then frying bacon, and then ended up with, you know, with the eggs, the egg part. So, for instance, a very short description how you should do that if you want to dub your game into a given language, right? So you should have a good reference material preparation. You should have a good kickoff conf call to discuss what you really want to achieve in your project, right? Then the next stage is the text translation. Then the first stage of LQA. It is really crucial. If you want to record voices for your game, you should have the first round of LQA before you start recording. Now, do you know why? Anyone? It will change for sure, but there will always be certain contextual mistakes done by translators, right? Because they have not seen the game, for instance, or the game was not finalized. So you need to assume that there will be contextual changes or some other kind of changes. If you pure your text or eradicate, you know, those mistakes from the written text, then the number of wrongly recorded lines will be way smaller. And recordings are usually the most expensive part of it. And calling the actor again to the studio, for instance, they had, let's say, an actor or an actress had 300 lines. It costs you a certain amount of cash. And then you want to call them for 50 lines or 15 lines or 10 lines. It's going to cost you almost as much as these 300 lines, right? Because they will just charge you for the, you know, coming to the studio time. So then you record, then you do the final LQA. That's in a very nutshell. I might have like a longish timeline here, but I don't want to bore you to death. So again, case study for anticipation. Project details. That was an indie publisher. All right. Then adventure psychological game, English translation, script preparation, and English dubbing. 20,000 words, 3,000 lines. And now boom, kaboom, right? There was no LQA prior to recordings. And assets, which means like the audio files were late. The recording window got shortened. So everything you might imagine about, you know, how it can be screwed up, it happened, right? So we, you know, we sent over the audio, and then finally they did the LQA. Now, when you are LQAing your game, meaning testing linguistically, this is this acceptable margin of like 2 to 5% of lines that can change. It's still like a normal thing, right? Of course, if it exceeds 10% or 20% or 30%, that means that either the audio was wrongly recorded or the text was badly translated. So this 5 to 2% of lines changed is an acceptable, like, middle grounds, right? And we evidently we received a faulty product. LQA found 12 lines, and money compensation, right? So it's like, huh? Seriously? I mean, even if we had LQA before recording, still 12 lines out of 3,000. Who is good at mathematics? How much is that? 12 out of 3,000 would be like 1/3%. Am I counting it correctly? Something like that. So like a marginal, minimal amount, right? And people who have been working with me for a longer time at Roboto, they know that when I start typing furiously like a mad pianist on my keyboard, that means I'm answering a difficult email, right? And this is like, this phrase here was one of the least difficult phrases that he wrote, that guy, in the email. So there were more of them referring to the intelligence of my people, etc. So that kind of thing, right? Hopefully and luckily and thankfully, he did not insult our mothers. Thank you, man, right? But aside from that, everything goes, right? So I was like... So now again, another piece of advice. When you are faced with that kind of situation, you really want to like, yeah, you see what I mean, right? So write the first draft, then save your draft, then read again, purge, your text of this, mother-related phrases, right? And then you can send it out. In that particular context, I actually, if I remember correctly, wrote 3 or 4 versions, right? So the first version cannot be quoted, the second also cannot be quoted, the third was almost there, and then the fourth one, I sent it over being very polite and being unemotional and helpful and explaining everything to that guy. I never received an answer to that email, never received an apology for this outburst of, anger, but they continued to work with us. So I read that as, oh yeah, I'm too ashamed now to tell you that I really behaved like a 5-year-old child, but yeah, we can continue working, right? So yeah, so that's the anticipation, plan ahead. If you don't plan ahead, we will not be able to do that for you. Sometimes we, anticipating that, for instance, we do enlist a new indie dev and we know it's the first or the second localization project for them or dubbing project or testing project. So we try to invite them, talk through the process, etc. If they listen, it's okay. But sometimes they just won't listen and then there you go, right? So I expect an apology, sir. Right, so number 4, reasonableness. Reasonableness is in a way a half-sister of symmetry. Right, so when you cooperate with someone, you would expect them to, well, there will be high expectations, basically, always, right? Because you are planning to spend your money, you would like to spend your money wisely, you would like to get a good, product in the end. So let's divide just a few expectations into reasonable ones and not so reasonable ones, right? So the reasonable expectations are pretty obvious, right? So it's availability, quality, good communication, support post-service, reasonable pricing, flexibility, right? It's like, sounds like cliche, right? But it's like in a nutshell, this is what you should be expecting from your outsource vendor. Now, I would draw your attention to support post-service. Which is crucial, by the way. So once the project is done, it's always good to talk it through. Even if it went smoothly, almost everything went fine, there is always room for improvement, just discussion, or just saying, hey, we are ready to do some more work for you if you need it. And then you can say, oh, we are happy with your service, we're going to be communicating with you later on with another project, for instance. Now, so those are reasonable expectations, but there are also unreasonable expectations, which are given as quotes. The 3 of them would be the most frequent ones. That's how they should never object to what we say. The role is to make up for the time we wasted. And I don't want to be bothered with questions, suggestions, whatever. Of course, no one says that to you directly, right? What is this, by the way? Sorry. Yeah, it's a, distracting mode. So no one will tell you that directly. It's like in this famous recent series of memes like, what does a usual email phrase mean, right? So, for instance, moving forward usually means, I don't care about your arguments, this is how it's going to play out. Or, as per my last email, which means actually in case you forgot how to read, for instance, right? So that kind of thing. So they never say it directly, but it's more or less sometimes, oh yeah, right. Actually, sometimes it happens. The Bart Simpson, actually, sometimes it happens. I don't know what kind of company that was, a foreign company, and they did not prepare, I know, it was first translated from Chinese to English, and then we're supposed to do it into Polish. Nightmare, right? And there are loads of different questions asked, and someone on the client side got irritated with the amount of it, and for one particular question, he wrote back with a picture of Bart Simpson writing on the blackboard, "I will not ask stupid questions." This is the reaction. So we say, okay, fine, we'll not be asking stupid questions, I guess. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, like a question, which gender is it, right? That's a stupid question for asking like the main character and his gender or her gender, right? This is a really stupid question. So those are the most frequent ones, but that's my personal favorite, the famous triangle. Do it with maximum quality at maximum speed with the minimum price. Yes. Kudos for someone who invented that kind of triangle. It's a Bermuda Triangle, basically. It's a fairy tale that doesn't happen in real world. I mean, a naive 6-year-old child might believe in this fairy tale, but this is not the fairy tale that will actually materialize in your lives. This is something that is going to change into a nightmare, a tale from the crypt, more like, than a fairy tale. And the case study here is going to show that. So Project DDES, this is one of the biggest ones we had to deal with. No. Yeah, right. All right, so that is a AAA indie dev, really famous, like everyone knows them. I don't want to mention the name because I feel sorry for them, basically. Now, it was an RPG, heavy narrative, 1.2 million words to localize from a very well-written English, like very poetic English, right, into different languages, which is, the amount is more or less 3 times the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And they expected to do that with no LQA, of course, obviously, in less than 4 months. And they figured we are from Poland, so we can cover Polish and Russian, as if it was so obvious. This is more or less the same, right? I mean, we all speak Russian, right? Yeah, of course, fluently. But anyway, so we decided to draw from that. And I was thinking, like, 4 months, a very difficult English text, a lot of text to localize, so they should pay dearly, but I knew straight off that they really don't want to splash out a lot of cash, right? So we quoted, and then we started a negotiation that looked like haggling with someone at the flea market in Dubai or Ankara or Egypt, right? It's like, yeah, can you please give us a lower rate and a lower rate and a lower rate? So we actually came to a border that it was like barely feasible for us. And they were still dissatisfied with the outcome. So they said, okay, sorry guys, but we are not going to choose you. We're not going to choose you. We're going to choose another company. And we said, okay, fine. You're right. I knew the rates were really low. So I asked, where is the company based? In California. Okay. We gave really low prices. Lots of people needed for that project. 4 months, Polish and Russian, California, us, okay, let it be. So they actually took off with some other company, but they were unlucky because they signed a global publishing deal with a company called Techland from Poland. And Techland is a long-time partner of ours. And when they, and then I still remember the situation. I was on a train from Gdynia to Warsaw, and I received a phone call from a guy in Techland, and he says, "Hey, Bartek, how are you? Blah blah blah. Are you working on that game?" And I say, "No, I'm not. Why are you asking?" Because we are supposed to publish that, and we sort of feel the quality might not be excellent. I was like, yeah, right. What a surprise, right? And but I wanted to be objective, so no one can accuse me of like being prejudiced against the other vendor, blah blah blah. So I sent out samples to 2 different editors to just, you know, come up with their answer, what the quality really is, right? So we've got this template where you take like 3,000 words and then you enumerate every single mistake from punctuation to grammar to mistranslation to whatever, and you start from 100 points and you end up with 0 points. So 100 means you're excellent, 0 points, it means you're not excellent, right? So whatever falls below the border of 80 points, it's like, it's not ideal. So now, check this. One editor came back with the answer, 11 points out of 100. Not really good, right? But the other one came up with something that surprised us because I didn't know it's even possible. It was minus 81. Minus 81, right? So still, I would say, we were joking, okay, so it's 80, so it's probably okay, right? So no, it's minus before this 80. So, so we did that, and now the most idiotic thing about this process is that, of course, Techland wanted us to correct the entire Polish text. By the way, the developer didn't agree to the correction of the Russian one, which was equally bad, by the way. And they charged those guys 6 times more than they economized choosing another vendor, right? So, okay, they splashed, and they didn't correct the Russian, and here's the excerpt from the reviews of the Russian localization of that game. It's hard to even understand what the game wants from the player. Or, the most annoying thing in the game is that the female heroes are addressed as he. And more stuff like that. There was even, now because those 2 languages were not the only ones, there were also some 3 more languages. There was Spanish, and I remember one of the Steam reviews, the localization of that game into Spanish causes cancer to the eye, something like that. So, but the point is, I mean, and that's the most absurd thing. When you make a mistake like that, being a developer, you would sort of assume that you will learn from that mistake. You would draw something from that mistake. No, they didn't. They just released another big title, RPG title, and there is this Polish localization which says, there is the, you know, the phrase close button. Whenever you close in the game, you close the button, right? How is it translated? It's like, close enough, something like that. Yeah, so it's like almost there, close enough, right? In every single place, it's like niemalże. O mały włos in Polish, right? O mały włos, by the skin of their teeth. So they just won't listen. So that's number 4. Now let's get to number 5 quickly, transparency. But by that, I mean just be open and sincere with each other, right? I mean, whether you are the freelancer and the outsource or you are outsourcing company, just, you know, be open with your communication. That's going to help. Do not hide things because it's the usual cause of trouble. Now remember, if you are a client and you want to choose your vendor, they usually aim for a long-term relation because it's the way it should function, right? So draw from that. So for instance, when the difficult times occur, even if you are a perfect marriage with your vendor, there are still going to be silent days, right? So instead of just throwing plates against your bedroom door, you might just come up with a few ideas. Weighted, carefully worded feedback, joint action, and then post-mortem. Because even if you are sure that you're right, you should first focus on like, let's just find a solution, and then we'll talk about it. So, and I shouldn't say that as an outsourced company, but if your post-mortem clearly indicates that your marriage is over, so to speak, then divorce your vendor, right? But then just shake hands, say goodbye, say good luck with some other people. Just don't offend mothers, right? Because it's not really well perceived by anyone. So. And I left my personal favorite towards the end. So one more case study about transparency. So there is the project details. There's a mid-sized publisher, action-adventure typing game, multi-language localization task, 10,000 words, non-exclusive deal, which means that they chose different vendors for different languages and they just, you know, put them all together later on. I really don't like that kind of setup because, you know, then the accountability dissipates among different vendors, which is not a preferred solution. But hey, they wanted that, they got that, right? So, okay, let's just see if, yeah. So we completed the task, no complaints whatsoever, everyone is like feeling happy, and then the publisher cuts off communication for no reason. So we figured, okay, perhaps the person who was responsible for it is not working anymore and they did not pass the details to the successor, or they have no new projects, blah, blah, blah. So we met them this year at Gamescom in Cologne and said, yeah, that's the moment when you actually ask a question, why are you silent? So this is the excerpt from a real conversation. So you say, yeah, right. Frankly, your Asian translations were so bad, we had trouble publishing in Japan, for example. And it's like, but we did not do any Asian languages in this game? And it's like, oh, Oh, okay, right, sorry guys, right? So, and they were silent for I don't know how much, like half a year probably, because they actually somehow thought that we were, you know, the Japanese translators, right? And just, okay, so these are the guys, we don't want to work with them anymore, but hey, we didn't do that even. So, yeah, be transparent. Now, summing up, when you want to work as an outsource or outsourcing your work, remember about symmetry, remember about modesty, remember about anticipation, remember about reasonableness, and remember about transparency, which in other words means be smart with whatever you do. Thank you. That's it. Now, I'm going to take your question as the first one, of course. Mm-hmm.
So in my company, we don't want to pay anything extra
Mm-hmm.
necessarily, but it's a lot more important that the quality is right
Mm-hmm.
because of compliance reasons and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we avoid a situation where you kind of assume that we want something lower and you budget for almost too few hours,
Mm-hmm.
so that we risk having like a non-perfect kind of translation?
Mm-hmm. Okay, there may be different solutions to that. Thanks for the question. It's a very important question. It appears quite frequently, by the way. So first of all, it's all about discussing before the project starts what is affordable, what is not affordable, what is the reasonable path, and what is not reasonable. So for instance, if there is no enough budget for testing linguistically, then at least we should both invest in the pre-translation phase, right? So you should be able to send us a game code to play through a little bit, right? We should have as much reference material as possible. There should be a person on your side asking any and all questions, even if they're stupid, right? So then you know, the gist is in the process, you know, that excludes LQA. Of course, if you ask me, is LQA needed, any number of hours is always better than no number of hours, right? So let me give you another instance of a real project. We had a localization of a fairly narrative game for German, Polish, and Russian. And we said, okay, guys, I know you don't have the budget for big testing, but at least allow us to have like 16 hours per language so we can see the fonts, if they display correctly, if or the initial stages at least are okay. Because sometimes people get prejudiced against the game after like 30 minutes because they saw something wrong in the localization. So if you cannot test everything, test at least the initial stages and whatever you can afford. And they didn't do that. And on the day of the release, we just, you know, out of our own accord, we bought this game in those 3 languages and everything exploded. So Cyrillics was not visible at all, and German and Polish lost all the diacritics. It could have been resolved like that before the release, even without huge LQA, right? But it wasn't. They didn't even implement, like they didn't even test the game for an hour before implementing. And what did they do? Day after the release on Steam, they removed the 3 language versions for 2 crucial weeks. They re-imported those languages later on, but they lost 2 weeks. It's really hard to measure how much they lost, but evidently they lost more than they would have paid for at least 8 hours of testing. So that kind of thing.
Okay, so you're saying more communication basically during the process. Does that not really risk that the scope kind of creeps? So,
What kind of scope? Scope, the budget scope or the work scope?
yeah, the work, the amount of hours that we can, because we set that at the beginning, no?
Mm-hmm.
So let's say we set 200 hours, we ended up needing 300 hours.
Mm-hmm.
How do we kind of reach, if 300 hours is perfect, how do we reach that in sort of a budget from the beginning?
Well, are you asking about how many hours there should be, or what happens when it gets bloated to 300 from 200?
Yeah, how to find like the optimum amount of hours in order for a perfect product and kind of value for money
Mm-hmm.
as early as possible.
Well, that's kind of doable, because then you need to tell me all about, you know, the way the game is narrated, right? I mean, what are the different ways of approaching the end? So the game may be like 10 hours long, but there may be like 10 different subplots. So based on those all subplots, I can more or less estimate how much time it should be for a perfect LQA, and then you tell me if that's, you know, within your budget. We will never exceed that budget without telling you, and we will never tell you like, okay, initially we wanted 200, now give me 1,000, right? No, that's not the thing. I mean, we need to be reasonable too, and we've done that so many times that you can compare your game with previous titles that were similar to yours. So this assessment can be fairly objective and workable. Okay, Anyone else? Yeah?
Yeah, sure. Is this thing on? Yeah. So I am the representative of QA company, so we do just functional QA. And sometimes we get tasks for testing localization kits. So some company, like probably LQA company, done the localization for all the text in the game. And we receive all the text, and we need to read through all the text and point out maybe missing points, missing letters, or everything else. How do you see, is this proper to give such a task for just a QA company because it's cheaper, or to give it to professional localization QA that they can point out some...
In an ideal world, compliance or functionality tester is a different kind of job than a linguistic tester, right? So these two things are actually separate services, right? So they should be separated as much as possible. Of course, if this is a French tester and you can actually get him to also do the LQA, but I sort of assume that those companies would like you to perform two services which are actually named as one service called QA, right? I mean, QA, functional or compliance, is different to linguistic testing in many reasons. Now, of course, when you do the compliance, for instance, then you need to check if those, you know...
if the texts are in the frames,
right,
and all this stuff.
So that should be separated. If they ask you to do that, they ask you to perform two services, and you should talk to them openly, right? I mean,
they also gave us Asian languages, so we're just like, is this the right thing that's drawn here? Because it's too much elements, and we can say for sure, so we report it anyway. When
you are sort of suspicious that something might be wrong, then probably your feedback should be conveyed again to the localization company that did that.
But do localization companies do such things? So when already some other company did all the translations, and you are just need to see if all the text's done right, or it is...
A proper linguistic testing would mean both, basically, right? So we need to check the quality of the text itself. So are there contextual mistakes? Are there no contextual mistakes, or any other grammatical mistakes? But also, are the text inside the lines? Do we have truncated text, cut-off text, right? Or do we have leftovers from English? That's also part of LQA, right? But functionality is like completely different thing, right? So you should be looking for different things. So if they want you to do both, you should talk to them openly. Okay, so it's not really actual functionality QA, it's linguistic QA, right? Dressed up as functionality QA. That's my opinion, humble opinion.
Thank you.
Anybody else? There are gifts for anyone who asks questions, so yeah. Oh, more questions. But unless you don't have, seriously, no one? No? Okay, so probably we should conclude.
Thank you for such interesting lecture.